So another match week of Premier League action has been and gone, and once again I found myself watching 5 matches over the weekend and learning 5 very different lessons. So like many of you guys, I started my Premier League weekend with the Merseyside derby, the early kickoff on Saturday, and I was entertained by what I saw. Actually, a really close football match. Liverpool started on fire, but Everton grew back into the game, and actually were probably unlucky not to get anything from this match. But what I want to talk about today, specifically from this particular match, was the use of the Liverpool fullbacks, particularly during the first 30 or 40 minutes of the match. You see, these days we see quite different fullbacks to what we've seen in the past. Once upon a time, fullbacks would spend the whole match flying around on the overlap to provide the width. More recently, we have seen an era of inverted fullbacks, and then even more recently, centre-backs at fullbacks that play in the defence. However, Liverpool were doing something very different. They were pushing their fullbacks really high and really central into these inverted positions. And it just highlights the versatility of these fullbacks. And that's the real lesson here. The fact that fullbacks can be used in so many different ways. For example, Liverpool were using their fullbacks to actually overload the Everton midfield. Everton had a bank of 5 at times across the pitch. But with Liverpool getting their fullbacks in there as well, alongside the 3 central midfielders, Liverpool simply had too many players. But these players, the fullbacks, weren't just there to be extra men, they were also occasionally there as decoys. Their runs off the ball were what Liverpool used to really break down the Everton defence. So for example, Konate would have the ball in a right-sided centre-back position, and Conor Bradley is going to start a little bit deeper and a little bit wider. What we are then going to see from him is a driving run, piercing the inside of the Everton defence. Now, of course, what this forces Everton to do is to collapse a little bit deeper and a little bit more central, because they can't afford for that player to have time in that part of the pitch. But this means Liverpool now have easy access to their winger. And we could also see the same on the other side. Van Dijk would have the ball, Kirkage would make a run like this, drag Everton deeper, and now the winger could receive the ball. The interesting thing is, Liverpool have wrong-footed wingers. So a left-footed winger on the right hand side of here, and a right-footed winger on the left, which means they then have that ability, with that underlapping run dragging the defence, they have that ability to come inside and then deliver into the box. And of course, that's exactly what we saw from Salah for Gravenberch's goal. It was absolutely brilliant, and it was all because of the decoy, central, high fullbacks. Now, the next match that I watched was Burnley's 1-1 draw with Nottingham Forest, and what we are discussing here is the evolution of a player role, and I am talking about Elliot Anderson. To be honest, this is the only reason I watch Nottingham Forest, because I want to see him play football, because he's one of my favourite players in world football at this moment in time. And what we've seen recently is a development and evolution in his role. Last season, he was very much used as part of a double pivot. You can see it in the average positions. He played with a central midfielder alongside him, and in matches, he was averaging around 54.2 touches per 90 minutes. This season, we are seeing something very different, particularly in this game. First of all, a lot of the time, he isn't operating in a double pivot. He's actually going and playing as a solo pivot, which again, you can see in the heat map here. He is the deepest midfielder by some distance, which means he becomes the pivot player for Forest. What has also changed is the number of touches he is having. In the past 4 matches, including games for England, he has had 127 touches, 93 touches, 94 touches, and 126 touches. That is an evolution of a role. Last season, he was sort of this box-to-box midfielder, but did a lot of defensive work and put out a lot of fires for the team. This year, he has become this sort of deep-lying playmaker at the start of the season, and it looks like Postecoglou and Tuchel both want to use him as their deepest midfielder. And the reason for that is because his passing is just brilliant. Look at his pass map from the weekend. He is really the orchestrator for this Forest side. Now, of course, Forest have problems elsewhere. They need to figure out their balance under their new manager. But Anderson is just a wonderful player. He's doing all of this great stuff on the ball. His tempo control is brilliant. But also, he is still contributing with a ridiculous amount of defensive work. All in all, a brilliant player that is evolving already. Now, the next match that I watched was Manchester United versus Chelsea. It was a big one, and very early on in the game, Robert Sanchez decided to get himself sent off. That's not the big talking point for me, though. The big talking point is the manager's reaction. I still cannot get my head around what Maresca was doing. So, of course, Sanchez gets injured, which means you need to bring a goalkeeper on. But you need to bring off one of the forwards to actually get your keeper on, right? Because defensively, you want to be solid. Now, what we saw was Esteval, the winger, came off for the goalkeeper. But 20 minutes later, Palmer came off, and everyone is excusing this because we know that Palmer had a knock before kickoff, right? So it was always going to be a difficult game for him. Why not take him off then? right? Why not bring him off for Jorgensen? That would have been the far more sensible change. Chelsea could have gone to a 4-4-1 shape like this and had plenty of outballs still. We know that Enzo Fernandez and Caicedo are brilliant with their defensive work. They cover a lot of ground, they're good and scrappy in midfield, Caicedo in particular. But then what you could have had was the technical quality of João Pedro to get you out of pressure, sort of a release valve, giving him the ball and asking him to look after it, which he actually did pretty well. But for it to be effective, you then got to have runners around him. You got to have players going past him. If you don't, the Manchester United players can squeeze super high, force Pedro under pressure, and he's sort of like 1 versus 3 now, which is quite a difficult job for any player to do. And United, therefore, were able to constantly nick the ball, and in the first half, completely dominate Chelsea. Completely dominate Chelsea because they didn't have an outball. Enzo Maresca, for me, got the subs wrong because it was Palmer eventually off. It was Estevao off. It was also Neto off for Adebayo and Santos. Now you can see Pedro is just so isolated. There's no runner in this big space over here or this big space over here. Areas that United can be vulnerable, there was none of it. And actually what made matters even worse was that eventually United also went down to 10 men. We take off a midfielder. But because Chelsea had already made so many negative subs in the game, they didn't actually have enough substitutes left to make some positive changes to get after United. United down to 10 men and potentially a little bit mentally vulnerable. Chelsea no longer had the players on the bench or on the pitch to make a change and get on the front foot. So all in all, in my opinion, a complete horror show in terms of the subs from Maresca. He set his team up more defensive, but they still weren't good defensively. They still conceded 2 goals and it just went horribly wrong. They lost all of their threat and any territory and any chance of winning this match. Now, speaking of a team lacking threat, it's time to talk about Aston Villa. They once again did not have a great weekend away at Sunderland, but they did score their first goal of the season. They were the only team in English football's top 7 divisions not to score. They finally scored a really well-worked goal. Not really. Actually, Cash just whacked it in from the edge of the box and the goalkeeper doesn't cover himself in glory. Outside of that, Aston Villa still lacked any attacking threat. They are still not good enough. And they do have a real problem. And I think the real problem is in the starting 11. Now, I think this 11 is good. I like several of these players and rate them really highly. The problem is it's just not fresh enough from last season or the season before. It's the same thing again. Of course, they brought a winger into the club, but I think he's currently being misprofiled. I think he's more of an inside player closer to goal. But apart from that, it's the same Villa team again. And what the best football teams do is they evolve. They add new things to their game. I don't really see that from Villa. They still play in a way where they often build up with 3 at the back. So one of the fullbacks comes inside. One of the other fullbacks is going to fly forward. And they will swap. So sometimes Digne will play deeper. The centre-backs will shift across. And now Cash goes forward. The problem is Villa have done this for the past 3 seasons. And they haven't really added anything to their game. And when they get into these forward positions, Cash and Digne, if it's the fullback forward, don't offer loads of attacking threat, and Buendia is just not what he once was in the Championship, probably isn't good enough to be playing for Aston Villa. I think you could solve this problem perhaps by getting a Harvey Elliott in the team, someone with a bit more spark, a bit more creativity, but right now, Villa are really slow, really stale. Something needs to change. They can't change too much in terms of personnel, because financially they were so restricted in the summer that they couldn't do much business. So therefore, Emery's got to get creative. He's got to evolve as a manager. Something which he has potentially struggled with in his career up to this point. Now is the time for him to prove that he is an elite manager because he can change. When his team's in crisis, he needs to save them with some tactical tweaks. Now, I'm not talking about ripping things up and starting again, but right now it's too slow, it's the same thing, and they've become a little bit predictable. Something needs to shift. And then we have the final match of the weekend, arguably the biggest in terms of 2 big teams going against each other and in terms of the Premier League title race. Manchester City raced into a 1-goal lead with Erling Haaland just being simply brilliant. Imagine my shock. He's always good against these Arsenal centre-backs, if you ask me, apart from one game. But after that, weird from City, the most anti-Pep Guardiola performance I have ever seen, particularly in the second half, particularly late on, when he takes off Haaland, he takes off Phil Foden, and he brings on Nathan Ake and Nico Gonzalez. Weird. Pep Guardiola pretty much went to eventually like a 5-5-0 formation, but at the best of times it was a 5-4-1. And I have never, ever seen, as far as I can recall, City playing in this way. Now, we've got to give them some credit, I guess. Defensively, they were very solid. They were very difficult to break down. Arsenal lacked any creative spark until Eze came onto the pitch. But Arsenal was struggling to break them down, so for that, City deserve credit. But I have one huge criticism of any team that defends deep for large periods. Eventually, something's going to happen. If you give a team like Arsenal, who have a lot of quality, the license to come forward again and again and keep attacking, eventually something's going to happen. They might get a lucky deflection and the ball ricochets into the back of the net. They might chuck a cross into the box, which goes behind for a corner, and Arsenal score from the resulting corner. Anything could happen, right? A City player might make a mistake. My point is, when you defend for such large parts of the game, I think you're always asking for the opposition to create something. However, having said that, Arsenal didn't for a long time, which is a problem for Arsenal as well. So a sort of bonus lesson there. Arsenal are not good enough at creating chances in open play. But eventually, ironically, the second that City played just a little bit higher with their defensive line, they did then get caught out behind because they didn't have any pressure on the ball. A very weird Manchester City performance. This is not a City side that was the same as 2 years ago. It's a very different team, much more vulnerable. Arsenal on the ball, not actually good enough to take the most and make the most of those vulnerabilities. All in all, a very weird weekend of Premier League performance. I couldn't say that one team particularly stood out as being particularly amazing. We saw some interesting use of fullbacks, some weird decisions at 10 men, some player roles evolving. There was a lot going on, but I'm not yet convinced by any side in the Premier League, apart from teams which might go down. There's some bad sides in the league this season. But in terms of the top end of the table, no one for me is running away with it, although of course Liverpool are now 5 wins from 5 and will feel that they are going to get better, so they're in a pretty good place. The rest have some serious work to do, but a good thing is there's 33 game weeks to go, which means there's 33 more of these videos coming, so you guys need to subscribe and get your notifications on so you don't miss a single one. Every week I will be bringing you the biggest lessons that I learned from the Premier League weekend, and I don't think you want to miss that because there's some interesting tactical points. But in terms of this weekend, we're now finished. No one standing out yet. It's going to be a very fascinating Premier League season because it's tightly contested because no one's amazing, which actually makes it really entertaining. There's a lot of errors going on. I'm enjoying it. I hope you guys are as well. But in terms of today, that is that. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed it. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.